Those huge number of these Ustasa, Croatia in groups in Yugoslavia, what is today Croatia, came to Bolivia. And they were offered lands by the governments in the 1950s and 60s, free land essentially in the region of Santa Cruz. A lot of it virgin land, some of it land where indigenous people lived, and they were cleared out, expelled from their own lands to make for these Ustasa Croatians to take land. Para que se asustan será pa' mejor. Es el pueblo entero el que ya está gritando. Viva la revolución.
Iranian nuclear weapons development.
They have turned the island into a communist hellhole.
The experiment in Venezuela has failed completely.
A lot of people, like you said, Ali, like don't even know, can't even point Bolivia on a map. Most people in the U.S., at least, because a lot of people in the U.S. are very politically ignorant, especially internationally. A lot of people aren't aware of the national dynamics and national differences. Can you give us a historical overview of Bolivia? Like, paint a picture for us as to like what the country's like, what are the demographics like, and how far back do these conflicts go? Because from what it seems to me, places like Santa Cruz for many years have been hotbeds of white supremacy and fascism because of the ethnic composition. Can you tell us a little bit about that, like the history of racial and class struggle in Bolivia?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's true. Most people in Europe or North America probably couldn't point out Bolivia on a map. But Bolivia is in the heart of South America, is right in the middle of South America. And is a very geographically is a very large country. Bolivia is land territory, is almost as big as continental Europe. However, our population is 11 million, which is very low. It's basically the size of London or size of Lima, and that's the entire population of Bolivia. But Bolivia is incredibly diverse geographically and culturally. So Bolivia has the Andean region, which is where we are now in La Paz. It's where my family's from, further down in Potosí. The highlands, altitude of 3,600 meters to 4,000 meters above sea level, where there's only 60% of the oxygen that you would have in countries that are at sea level. It also has the Amazon. A large part of the Amazon rainforest is in Bolivia, in the northern parts. You've got the map there where it says Cobija, Trinidad. Those are all Amazon regions. So almost a third of the country is the Amazon rainforest. Then further down, where we can see on your map here, Santa Cruz, that is essentially the Amazon basin, is sort of lowlands, savannas, what we call in Spanish the llanos, the flatlands, savannas, sort of tropical type climates. And then in the south, where you can see the dot that says Tarija, that is a region known as the Chaco region, which is essentially a desert region, very similar to the geography of northern Argentina and Paraguay. Flatlands, dry desert, lots of oil there. And so in all of these different types of diverse geography, you get lots of different cultures as well. Bolivia has 36 indigenous nations recognized in the constitution introduced in 2009 by Evo Morales. 36 different indigenous nations within all of this different types of geography. And historically, during the period of the Spanish Empire, the economic center of Bolivia was here on the left. People might see where the dot that says Oruro, Potosí. Potosí was the center because there was the silver mines. That's where they mine silver. That the enormous wealth that there was in this Andean region. My own family's from the north of Potosí, where that dot that says Potosí, and the mining town of Uncía, that silver, tin, and in the north of Bolivia, there's gold as well. That funded European imperialism for many years. The development of Europe over centuries laid the groundwork for the industrialization of Europe. That was the economic center of Bolivia. Up until, say, after independence, this region here, Santa Cruz, which we're talking about now, was very sparsely populated. Only mostly indigenous groups, including the Guarani, Ayorero, and other indigenous groups, very far apart from each other, very sparsely populated. It was mostly a savanna forest. In the 1970s, there's a coup led by Hugo Banzer, a US-funded agent who comes from this region and essentially used the wealth of Potosí to fund Santa Cruz. What happened before this? I'm going to go back a little bit. World War II happens in Europe, okay? We know I'm sure a lot of people know the history of some Nazi figures, Nazi generals going to places like Argentina, Brazil, Chile. Even today in Chile, there's an entire village, what's it called? Villa Dignidad. Pure Nazis, direct descendants of Nazi Germans. In Brazil as well, the south of Brazil, there's entire communities that speak German. In Bolivia, some Germans came. You mentioned Klaus Barbie, one of the top Nazi generals, came to Bolivia. Very few, though, Nazi Germans. Who came? Ustasa Croatians. Who's the Ustasa? Were the collaborators with the Nazis during World War II when Germany invaded Croatia. And the Ustasa were considered so brutal that even the Nazi Germans saw them as just too barbaric in terms of the racial violence they committed in Croatia, well, in Yugoslavia, what is today Croatia. Those huge number of these Ustasa Croatia groups in Yugoslavia, what is today Croatia, came to Bolivia. And they were offered lands by the governments in the 1950s and 60s, free land essentially in the region of Santa Cruz. A lot of it virgin land, some of it land where indigenous people lived, and they were cleared out, expelled from their own lands to make for these Ustasa Croatians to take land. Fast forward to 1960s, 70s. You have the coup by the person I mentioned, Hugo Banzer. From this region, he funds the development of Santa Cruz from a rural area into an urban city in order to benefit these Croatian Ustasa descendant families that have the land there in Santa Cruz. So Santa Cruz becomes the economic powerhouse, but their development was funded by the mines of the Andes, of the indigenous Quechua towns of North Potosí, where my own family comes from. So that's where the Santa Cruz becomes, an economic powerhouse within Bolivia. It was a deliberate policy. Santa Cruz City didn't exist before the 70s. It didn't exist. It was created in the 70s using the wealth of the mines of the Andes. So that's a bit of the history of how Santa Cruz came to be and why the context of the racial politics, because most of the largest landowners in the areas of Santa Cruz are the descendants of the Ustasa, Croatian, what was then Yugoslavia, now Croatia, and on the expulsion of the indigenous Amazonian lowland communities that lived and still live in those regions. So the whole city was built on the logic of genocide, of displacing indigenous peoples. And so now, today, that mentality lives on among those elites. They say, we are, in the Andes, they're Indios. They live in the cerros, they live in the mountains. We're more modern, we're whiter, we're more Europeanized. But that is where that European influence comes from.
Wow, such a great breakdown, Ali. I really appreciate that. Such an interesting history. It's really insane to hear about that, and also to hear about the mindset of fascism, and in particular eugenics. This idea that indigenous people are, quote, savages, that they aren't able to understand politics and economics. They can't run an economy. And we saw a lot of that. We heard a lot of that in 2019 from
Yeah,
Janine
Ramiro,
Agnes and others. Yeah,
can I add is another aspect that's really perverse about this logic is the idea of us. So, as I told you the history of Santa Cruz about the Croatian influence, people coming from Europe after World War II, expelling indigenous communities, etc. They then create an idea. It's called the Nación Camba. Nación Camba. That's the people of Santa Cruz. There's the idea that is based off the European settlers that go to live there. Now, a lot of this conflict that we're seeing now is those people saying that we are the Nación Camba, we are the owners of, this is our land, and there are indigenous Andeans from La Paz or Potosí or Oruro who come to live here, and they are invaders. They're invaders in this land. When they themselves have... Do you know the name of the economy minister under Henry Náñez? Do you know what his name was? Branko Marinkovic. Branko Marinkovic. Does that sound to you like a Latin American name? Branko Marinkovic.
Hell no, definitely not.
Do you know the president of the Asamblea Departamental, which is like the state congress within Santa Cruz? Zvonko Ivanovic. Does that sound like a Latin American name to you?
Hell no.
Zvonko as a first name.
Hell no.
And they say that when Andean people, including, I've got one of my own cousins has gone to now lives in Santa Cruz. That when an Andean indigenous person moves within their own country from, say, La Paz or Oruro, Potosí to Santa Cruz, that they are invaders in Santa Cruz, and that they are guests in Santa Cruz within their own country. They are migrants, immigrants. You're an immigrant in your own country. That is the discourse from people who have names like Zvonko, Marinkovic. So this is the perversion of this kind of racial politics that exists.
Wow, it literally reminds you of Israel and Palestine. Like, you have these Zionists, these like pale, dying Zionists who are like, these are my lands, these are my territory, the Palestinian Arabs are invaders. And in many ways, it reminds me of Zionism and settler colonialism of the flavor of South Africa with apartheid. It's just insane to me.